The air in the hollow was wrong that winter. Too still, too heavy, like the sky itself was waiting for something to die. They said the snow fell silent that night, muffling even the sound of the trees cracking under their own frost. But there were other sounds, low and wet, echoing through the timber frame of a rotting cabin, the strained breath of a woman, the trembling rasp of someone calling for help who no longer believed help could come. Inside that cabin, on a mattress stuffed with corn husks and mold, she lay drenched in sweat, her body twisting in agony. Her name was Dela Whitaker, 20, 7 years old and 8 months pregnant. Her hair clung to her face in knots, her lips pale, her eyes glassy. Outside, the hills whispered, the creek muttered beneath its frozen skin, and the world watched as something impossible prepared to be born. Her husband had been dead for over a year. Everyone in the hollow knew that. They'd buried him themselves, buried him deep, with his crushed skull wrapped in a burlap sack, because his face was no longer fit for the eyes of the living. And yet, here she was, her belly distended, her breath hitching in painful rhythm, crying out a name no one dared to repeat. When the doctor finally came, called by a neighbor's trembling hand, it was already too late for reason. The road was nothing but mud and ice. His horse slipped twice before reaching the clearing. He found her cabin half collapsed, smoke trickling from a chimney that hadn't seen a proper fire in months. The smell met him before the door did decay. Sweat. Something sharp and sweet like rot blooming inside the body. He thought he'd seen hardship before. Mountain fevers, stillbirths, the slow wasting of children. But nothing prepared him for what he saw when he peeled back that filthy quilt. The child was moving. Not with the rhythm of life, but with something else, something wrong. Its shape pressed against her skin, shifting under the surface like it was trying to crawl its way out of her. She looked at him then, eyes wide and wet with fever, and whispered a name that made his blood freeze solid. It wasn't her husband's name. It wasn't any name a woman should ever speak in that way. The doctor staggered back, knocking over his lantern, and for one brief, flickering instant, the walls around them glowed red. The air smelled of smoke, of rust, of something old that had finally been disturbed. The hills outside stayed silent, because they already knew what he was about to discover. That the thing inside her wasn't just a child. It was the final echo of a family that had been marrying itself to death for nearly 2 centuries. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The whisper of the storm died at her window. Only the sound of her breath filled the cabin now, shallow, uneven, carrying the weight of generations. The doctor, his name was Harrison Crew, set down his lantern and forced himself to move closer. The shadows clung to him as if trying to pull him back, warning him not to interfere, not to look too closely at what lay before him. Dela's face was drawn tight, her skin the grey of river stones. She clutched at the thin sheet that barely covered her, eyes rolling back in her head as another wave of pain tore through her body. He tried to speak, to ask when the labor had started, but she only stared at him with that vacant, unfocused gaze. When she opened her mouth to answer, the words came out slurred, strangled by the cleft in her palate. They sounded less like speech and more like a child trying to remember a language it had never fully learned. Outside, the wind carried the smell of wet pine and distant wood smoke. Inside, it was only sickness and silence. The doctor could see now that she'd been in labor for days, her body too weak to finish what it had begun. Every time she pushed, her breath caught, and her heart seemed to stop for a moment, before stumbling back into rhythm. He'd seen women die like this, but never this far gone, never with a belly that moved like a living thing inside a coffin. When he asked about the father, she blinked slowly. Then she whispered the name again. Earl. Doctor. Crew remembered the name from the burial ledger. Earl Whitaker, drowned in the creek the summer before. The handwriting on that record was faint, as if whoever wrote it had wanted to erase it, even while it was being written. Dela's eyes filled with tears when he said it aloud, not from shame or confusion, but from something more complicated, more ancient. Family, she murmured. He said it was all right, we're family. Crew felt his throat tighten. He looked around the cabin, the sagging walls patched with bark, the dirt floor, the blackened kettle by the hearth, and he understood what she meant. There was no one else here. There hadn't been for a very long time. The Whitakers had folded in on themselves like a dying star, collapsing into the gravity of their own bloodline. When the next contraction hit, Dela screamed. It wasn't the cry of pain he was used to. It was something deeper, something that scraped the bones of the room. Crew grabbed his tools, his hands shaking, and braced for whatever was about to emerge from the ruin of her body. He would remember the sound forever, the wet, uneven gasp of a thing that should not have lived. And outside, in the freezing dark, the hills seemed to sigh. The old ones used to say the land remembers. That night, it began to remember again. For a moment, there was no sound, no crying, no breathing, just the faint hiss of the oil lamp and the brittle creak of the roof above them. Then, slowly, something began to move in the doctor's hands. It was small, slick with blood and membrane, its skin the color of candle wax. He waited for the wail, that first proof of life, but none came. The thing only twitched once, its limbs jerking in a way that didn't seem to follow any rhythm known to flesh. Crew leaned closer, wiping the blood from its face with a trembling rag. But the more he looked, the less human it appeared. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were clouded, unfocused, set too far apart. Its nose was sunken flat, and its mouth, when it opened, was small and lipless, like a cut that had never healed. A faint gurgle slipped from it, something between a breath and a growl. Dela was still alive, barely. Her head rolled toward him, and she whispered, "Don't hurt him. He's all I have left of Earl." The doctor swallowed hard. "Dela, Earl's been dead a long time." She smiled faintly, her teeth red with blood. "Not for me." Outside, the wind began to rise again, pressing against the walls as though the forest itself were listening. Crew could feel it, something watching, something close. He had delivered malformed children before, victims of disease, starvation, and incestuous bloodlines, but this was different. This wasn't simply the product of human decay. There was intention in its form, like it had been shaped by something old and cruel. The baby's hand reached out, brushing his wrist. It was cold, colder than any living thing should be. Crew jerked back instinctively, knocking over his scalpel, which clattered against the floorboards. The infant turned its head toward the sound with a slow, unnatural precision, as if it were listening not with its ears, but with something deeper, something inside the marrow. Then Dela screamed again, her body convulsing. He thought it was another wave of pain, but when he lifted the blanket, his stomach twisted. She wasn't bleeding, she was tearing apart. Something else was coming. The lantern flickered. Shadows lengthened across the walls. For the first time in his life, Dr. Crew forgot his training, forgot his faith, forgot everything but the terror rising in his chest. He backed toward the door, But before he could reach it, a sound filled the cabin, a low, guttural coo that didn't belong to any child or beast he knew. And then, beneath that sound, he heard another voice whispering from under the floorboards. Soft, male, familiar. It was calling Dela's name. The dead husband's name was Earl. And in that cabin, a year after they buried him, Earl Whitaker had found his way home. The voice was faint at first, almost like wind dragging through the cracks in the floorboards. But the more Dr. Crew listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the moan of settling wood, nor the creak of a cabin giving in to rot. It was speech, and it was saying her name, Dela. The sound was wet, gurgling like a throat full of river water trying to remember how to talk. Crew froze where he stood. The oil lamp flickered low, the shadows bending long across the walls. Dela's body was limp now, her eyes rolled back, her chest barely moving. The child, or what he still told himself was a child, was quiet in its blanket, twitching from time to time, as though hearing something only it could understand. The doctor forced his shaking hand toward the lantern and turned up the flame. Its light spread just enough to reveal the cracks between the warped floorboards. Something dark glistened beneath them. Water, he thought at first. But the smell that reached him told another story. Not the clean rot of swamp water. This was the smell of flesh long sealed away. He knelt, pressing his ear to the floor. The voice came again. Closer now, clearer. Dela, open the door. There was no door beneath the floor. Just packed dirt. Just the earth. Crew stumbled back, clutching the lamp, as if it could burn away what he'd just heard. His heart pounded in his throat. He looked to Dela, hoping to find her dead, hoping at least for stillness. But her lips had started to move again. She was whispering back to the voice, answering it like a wife to her husband returning home late. Soon, she breathed. Soon. Earl. And then the baby began to cry. It wasn't a cry like any he had ever heard. It rose and fell in strange, broken notes, the pitch shifting too quickly, too sharply. Like the sound of something trying to mimic humanity, but not quite understanding the shape of it. The walls seemed to breathe with the sound. The boards beneath his boots trembled. Dust rained down from the rafters as the cabin moaned under an invisible weight. Crew staggered toward the door, but something stopped him. A nail, just one, had come loose from the planks below. It twisted itself upward with a slow, shrieking groan as if pushed from underneath. Then another, and another. He dropped the lamp. It shattered on the floor, the oil spreading, flame licking across the boards in thin, orange tongues. And through the rising smoke, he saw it, a pale hand, bloated and grey, pressing up from the dirt beneath the floor. The fingers bent wrong, too many joints, too many knuckles. It reached for Dela. The child's cries grew louder, almost joyful now. The land had remembered the Whitakers, and it was coming to reclaim what was left of them. The hand did not claw its way free all at once. It pushed slow, deliberate, like it knew exactly how long to make him wait. Each nail, tipped finger rose through the boards, scraping splinters loose, flexing in the lantern's dying light. Smoke rolled low across the floor. Crew stumbled backward until his shoulders struck the wall. His mind, trained in anatomy and medicine, tried to make sense of what he saw. Rigor, decomposition, nerve contraction. But the thing's skin moved like something still alive. Beneath the rot, veins pulsed faintly. And when the palm flattened against the floor, it left a smear of mud the color of blood gone black. The voice came again, this time not from below, but from everywhere. Dela, you promised. Her eyes opened. The whites were gone. replaced by the dull grey of creek water. Her mouth twitched into a smile. "I waited," she whispered. "You said you'd come back when the snow fell quiet." The boards between them buckled. A smell of stagnant water filled the air. Crew covered his mouth, gagging. But his eyes stayed fixed on the hole widening at the center of the room. He could see movement in the dark beneath. A ripple, a shape twisting in the earth like a body swimming through soil. Then came the rest of it. A forearm, a shoulder, a head, half collapsed, hair hanging in clumps. The face was familiar, not because he knew the man, but because it bore the unmistakable stamp of the Whitaker line, the sloping brow, the wide, set eyes, the mouth that seemed too small for speech. Earl Whitaker's corpse, or what was left of it, dragged itself halfway into the light and looked at him. It smiled. Crew's breath caught in his chest. The jaw moved, and a thick stream of river water poured from its mouth, spilling over the floorboards. The baby answered with a high, gurgling sound that almost matched the rhythm of that bubbling water. Earl's ruined hand reached toward the crib. Dela tried to sit up, her body trembling, her abdomen caving inward, as though something inside her was still feeding. She stretched one arm toward her husband, whispering, "Take him." That word shattered the doctor's paralysis. He lunged forward, kicking the crib away, scooping the newborn into his arms. The child writhed against him, cold as stone, skin slick with something that stung his fingers. He ran for the door, but when he pulled it open, there was no snowstorm, no road, just a wall of dark water standing upright like glass, reflecting his own terrified face. Behind him, Dela's voice rose into a howl. Earl's body began to sink back into the earth, dragging her with it. The floor split, boards snapping like ribs, and the fire spread across the cabin, orange light painting the scene in fever colors. Crew stumbled out the window instead, landing hard in the frozen mud. He didn't look back. The child's cries faded against his chest, replaced by a deep, rhythmic sound, like the slow turning of water under ice. When he finally dared to look over his shoulder, the cabin was gone. Only the hollow remained, quiet, unbroken, untouched. And in his arms, the baby had stopped breathing, or maybe it had never breathed at all. "Doctor." Crew didn't remember running. Only the sound of his boots hammering the frozen dirt. The rhythm of panic keeping time with his heartbeat. The forest pressed close around him, the trees leaning in like witnesses too afraid to speak. He could still feel the weight in his arms, the small, still body wrapped in a blanket gone stiff with frozen blood. He told himself he was taking it to town, to study, to prove what he'd seen. But somewhere deeper, he knew he was just running from the hills, from whatever had crawled up through that cabin floor. By the time the sun rose, the road had thinned into nothing but ruts and ice. His horse had bolted hours before, spooked by the sound of something moving beneath the frost. He'd been walking ever since, his hands numb, his breath fogging before him like smoke from a dying fire. When the child stirred, the sound was soft, almost gentle, like a sigh. Crew froze. He looked down. The blanket twitched once, then again. He pulled it open. The baby's eyes were open. He had checked a dozen times that it wasn't breathing. Its skin had gone pale, lips blue, small chest still, but now the eyes stared back at him. Dark, unblinking, glassy as polished coal. They moved slowly, tracking him with the dull precision of an animal that had never seen light before. And then came the sound. It wasn't a cry this time. It was a voice. Weak, rasping, shaped like words that didn't belong in the mouth of a newborn. "Cold," it whispered. "Mama's cold." Crew staggered back, nearly dropping it. His mind rebelled against what he heard. The voice was small, yes, but there was something beneath it. An echo. A second tone. Older male. A man's voice riding beneath the child's breath. Earl, Crew whispered without meaning to. The baby smiled. The corners of its mouth split slightly, the skin stretching too far. And for just a heartbeat, he thought he saw something glint behind its gums. Not teeth, but small white fragments, like bone shards pressed into its flesh. He wanted to throw it, to leave it there in the snow, to end it. But the moment he thought it, the wind shifted, and the whisper came again. Not from the baby this time, but from the trees. You can't leave, family. He turned in circles, scanning the tree line. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustle of life, only the whisper of moving water somewhere below the ice. The baby had gone quiet again. Its tiny hand reached from the blanket, touching his wrist with that same corpse, cold grip. And then, just barely audible, almost kind, "Take me home, doctor." Crew didn't move for a long time. The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The hills in the distance seemed to blur into shadow, the same shadow he'd left behind. He started walking again, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe he thought he was going toward the town. Maybe he wasn't. By nightfall, the tracks behind him had already filled in with snow. And somewhere deep in the hollow, something was laughing in a voice that wasn't quite human anymore. By the second night, the wind had changed. It came from the south now, carrying the scent of ash and river clay. Familiar, intimate, like breath on the back of his neck. Dr. Crew didn't know when he'd stopped trying to find the road. The forest had turned in on itself. The path wound in circles, the trees crowding tighter each time he looked back. He thought he was walking toward town. But with every mile, the slope beneath his boots began to feel steeper, the air colder, the light thinner. He recognized the trees, not their shapes, but their scars. A bent cedar split by lightning, a birch marked with 3 long gashes as if clawed open. He'd passed them before, hours ago, days maybe. He stopped to rest against a stump, clutching the bundle to his chest. The child hadn't spoken since the morning, but its body was warm now, too warm, as though it were feeding on the cold itself. Steam rose faintly from the folds of the blanket. Crew whispered to himself, "You're dead. You have to be dead." But the weight in his arms shifted. A sound came, low and almost affectionate, a murmur in 2 voices. One small, one deep, overlapping in a rhythm that made his stomach twist. He pulled back the blanket an inch and froze. The baby's skin had changed. The waxy pallor was gone, replaced by something slick and gray, like the sheen of fish scales under moonlight. Its mouth was moving silently, as though mouthing prayers in a language older than sound. Crew clamped the blanket shut and staggered to his feet. Panic was the only thing left in him now. No logic, no training, just the raw animal need to get away. He ran. Branches tore at his coat, snow stung his eyes, the world collapsing into shadow and breath. Then he saw it. A light through the trees, flickering, familiar. He stumbled toward it, heart leaping with hope, and then dread. Because as the light grew stronger, he recognized its glow. It wasn't lantern light. It was fire, the cabin. But it couldn't be. He'd watched it burn. He'd seen it vanish into the hollow. Yet there it stood, whole again, standing against the dark like it had never fallen. The same sagging roof, the same leaning door, the same thin smoke curling from the chimney. The snow around it was untouched. No footprints, no sign of life. The baby began to stir. Crew held it tighter, whispering, "No, no." No, but the voice that came from the bundle wasn't his to answer anymore. "Home," it said. The front door creaked open on its own. Warm, yellow light spilled out into the clearing, and from inside came the sound of a woman humming, soft, slow, tuneless. Dela. Crew felt his knees weaken. He wanted to turn and run, but the world seemed to hold him still. The baby's hand reached toward the door. He took one step forward, then another. Behind him, the forest exhaled, a single, long breath of cold that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. The door waited open. The hollow had led him home. The door hung half open, its hinges whispering in the wind like a throat clearing after a long silence. The air that spilled from within was not warm the way firelight should be. It was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and old breath. Still, Dr. Crew stepped across the threshold. The floor did not creak this time. It felt soft beneath his boots, as if the wood had gone porous, as if the house itself were listening. Inside, nothing had burned. The walls were whole again, but darker, glazed with a sheen like varnish. When he raised the lamp, he saw that it wasn't varnish at all. Each board was etched with tiny grooves, looping patterns that, when followed with the eye, formed faces. Generations of them. Broad-jawed men, hollow-cheeked women, their features repeating, distorting, folding inward until the lines became a single shape, the Whitaker face. He ran a hand over one carving. It was warm. From deeper in the house came the hum again. The lullaby Dela had whispered to her stillborns. The one mothers in these hills used to hush the wind. Crew followed it down the narrow hall. The baby in his arms had gone quiet. He could feel the faint pulse of it through the blanket, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of that humming. The hall opened into what should have been the kitchen, but the space had changed. The walls breathed, the ceiling sagged low, and in the center stood a cradle made from tree roots twisted together, each root pulsing faintly with a heartbeat of its own. In it sat Dela, or what was left of her. Her hair hung like riverweed. Her skin shimmered with the same grey sheen as the child's. When she lifted her head, her neck cracked like breaking twigs. Her eyes were black hollows reflecting the flame. "You brought him home," she said. The words came out through a mouth that barely moved. "We've been waiting." Crew backed away, clutching the child tighter. "You're dead," he whispered. Dela smiled. "Dead things remember, Doctor. The hills remember. Every drop that runs down the mountain finds its way back to the same creek. Blood is the same." The carvings on the walls began to move then. Slowly at first, the faces shifting in the lamplight. He watched as one peeled open its mouth, as if taking a breath, and from that wooden throat came a low murmur. Dozens of voices joined it, a chorus of names whispered through time. Earl, Clara, Josiah, Mercy, Dela, each name older, more broken, until the sound became a drone, vibrating the air. The baby stirred. Crew looked down and saw its eyes had changed again. Wide, black, endless. It reached a hand toward the walls, and every carved face turned toward it in recognition. The humming stopped. Dela stood. "No, you know why we don't leave," she said softly. "Why the hills keep us. Why the water tastes like iron." A Crew tried to speak, but the air was gone from his lungs. He felt something coil around his ankles, roots, wet and cold, rising through the cracks in the floor. They tightened, pulling him down inch by inch. The last thing he saw before the light died was the cradle beginning to rock on its own. Dela leaning over it, whispering words that had no sound, and the child in his arms whispering them back. The house groaned like a living thing. Each beam flexed, each nail sang in the heat. the air thick with the smell of burning pine and damp soil. Dr. Crew clawed at the floor, his fingernails splitting. But the roots held him fast. Alive, tightening, pulling him down through the warped boards toward the earth beneath. The blanket in his arms slipped away. The child was no longer a weight, but a warmth moving on its own, sliding toward the cradle that waited at the room's center. He saw Dela bend over it, humming the same melody that had brought the storm, her hands hovering above the infant, like a priest anointing a god. The light from the hearth shivered, and for a heartbeat Crew saw what she cradled not one face, but many, flickering and blending, every Whitaker who had ever been born in these hills. Their features merged and split, a river of flesh folding back into itself. Crew forced out a breath. "Why me?" Dela looked up. Her eyes glowed faintly, pupils dilating until her face was nothing but shadow. "Because you came," she said. "Because the land needed a witness again." The roots pulled harder. Cold mud rose around his legs, seeping into his skin. His pulse hammered once, twice, then slowed as something older than him began to replace it. The carvings on the walls trembled, the faces turned. The chorus began again, not screaming, not pleading, only reciting the same phrase in 100 cracked voices. Blood remembers. The cradle rocked faster. The baby's small hands reached into the air, its breath condensing into a mist that hung above them like smoke. Shapes formed inside that mist. Farms, graves, cabins rotting back into soil, all of it folding into the same valley, the same creek that ran black beneath the hills. The house shuddered once more, and then the floor gave way. Crew fell through darkness that wasn't air but water, cold and endless. He tried to scream, but the sound came out as bubbles of blood. Below him, he saw faces rising. Earl Dela, all the rest, pale and swollen, their mouths opening to welcome him home. When morning came, the cabin was empty again. The snow lay smooth across the clearing, unbroken. The doctor's horse grazed nearby, untethered, its breath steaming in the cold. Of the man himself, there was no sign, only a stethoscope half buried in the mud, and the faint cry of a child drifting from beneath the frozen creek. The hills of the Ozarks stand quiet to this day. The locals still talk about that winter, about the strange lights in the trees and the smell of smoke that never came from any fire. And if you stand by the creek on the coldest nights, you can hear it under the ice, the sound of a lullaby sung in two voices. One is a mother's, the other is still learning the words.